Chapters 25 and 26 of The Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. While this sufficiently intimate colloquy, prolonged for some time after we ceased to follow it, went forward, Madame Merle and her companion, breaking a silence of some duration, had begun to exchange remarks. They were sitting in an attitude of unexpressed expectancy, an attitude especially marked on the part of the Countess Gemini, who, being of a more nervous temperament than her friend, practised with less success the art of disguising impatience. What these ladies were waiting for would not have been apparent, and was perhaps not very definite to their own minds. Madame Merle waited for Osmond to release their young friend from her tete-a-tete, and the Countess waited because Madame Merle did. The Countess, moreover, by waiting, found the time ripe for one of her pretty perversities. She might have desired for some minutes to place it. Her brother wandered with Isabel to the end of the garden, to which point her eyes followed them. 'My dear,' she then observed to her companion, 'you'll excuse me if I don't congratulate you.' 'Very willingly, for I don't in the least know why you should.' 'Haven't you a little plan that you think rather well of?' And the Countess nodded at the sequestered couple. Madame Merle's eyes took the same direction, then she looked serenely at her neighbour. 'You know I never understand you very well,' she smiled. 'No one can understand better than you when you wish. I see that just now you don't wish.' 'You say things to me that no one else does,' said Madame Merle gravely, yet without bitterness. 'You mean things you don't like? Doesn't Osmond sometimes say such things?' 'What your brother says has a point.' 'Yes, a poisoned one sometimes. If you mean that I'm not so clever as he, you mustn't think I shall suffer from your sense of our difference. But it will be much better that you should understand me.' 'Why so?' asked Madame Merle. 'To what will it conduce?' 'If I don't approve of your plan you ought to know it in order to appreciate the danger of my interfering with it.' Madame Merle looked as if she were ready to admit that there might be something in this, but in a moment she said quietly, 'You think me more calculating than I am.' 'It's not your calculating I think ill of, it's your calculating wrong. You've done so in this case.' 'You must have made extensive calculations yourself to discover that.' 'No, I've not had time. I've seen the girl but this once,' said the Countess, 'and the conviction has suddenly come to me. I like her very much.' 'So do I,' Madame Merle mentioned. 'You've a strange way of showing it.' 'Surely I've given her the advantage of making your acquaintance.' 'That indeed,' piped the Countess, 'is perhaps the best thing that could happen to her.' Madame Merle said nothing for some time. The Countess's manner was odious, was really low; but it was an old story, and with her eyes upon the violet slope of Monte Morello, she gave herself up to reflection. 'My dear lady,' she finally resumed, 'I advise you not to agitate yourself. The matter you allude to concerns three persons much stronger of purpose than yourself.' 'Three persons? You and Osmond, of course. But is Miss Archer also very strong of purpose?' 'Quite as much so as we.' 'Ah, then,' said the Countess radiantly, 'if I convince her it's her interest to resist you, she'll do so successfully.' 'Resist us? Why do you express yourself so coarsely? She's not exposed to compulsion or deception.' 'I'm not sure of that. You're capable of anything, you and Osmond. I don't mean Osmond by himself, and I don't mean you by yourself. But together you're dangerous, like some chemical combination.' 'You had better leave us alone, then,' smiled Madame Merle. 'I don't mean to touch you, but I shall talk to that girl.' 'My poor Amy,' Madame Merle murmured, 'I don't see what has got into your head.' 'I take an interest in her. That's what has got into my head. I like her.' Madame Merle hesitated a moment. 'I don't think she likes you.' The Countess's bright little eyes expanded, and her face was set in a grimace. Ah, you are dangerous, even by yourself." "If you want to like her, you don't abuse your brother to her," said Madame Merle. "I don't suppose you pretend she has fallen in love with him in 2 interviews." Madame Merle looked a moment at Isabel and at the master of the house. He was leaning against the parapet facing her, his arms folded, and she at present was evidently not lost in the mere impersonal view persistently as she gazed at it. As Madame Merle watched her she lowered her eyes. She was listening, possibly, with a certain embarrassment, while she pressed the point of her parasol into the path. Madame Merle rose from her chair. "Yes, I think so," she pronounced. The shabby footboy, summoned by Pansy, he might, tarnished as to livery and quaint as to type, have issued from some stray sketch of old-time manners, been put in by the brush of a Longhi or a Goya, had come out with a small table and placed it on the grass, and then had gone back and fetched the tea-tray, after which he had again disappeared, to return with a couple of chairs. Pansy had watched these proceedings with the deepest interest, standing with her small hands folded together upon the front of her scanty frock. But she had not presumed to offer assistance. When the tea-table had been arranged, however, she gently approached her aunt. "Do you think papa would object to my making the tea?" The Countess looked at her with a deliberately critical gaze, and without answering her question. "My poor niece," she said, "is that your best frock?" "Ah, no," Pansy answered. "It's just a little toilette for common occasions." "Do you call it a common occasion when I come to see you? To say nothing of Madame Merle and the pretty lady yonder." Pansy reflected a moment, turning gravely from one of the persons mentioned to the other. Then her face broke into its perfect smile. "I have a pretty dress, but even that one's very simple. Why should I expose it beside your beautiful things?" "Because it's the prettiest you have. For me you must always wear the prettiest. Please put it on the next time. It seems to me they don't dress you so well as they might." The child sparingly stroked down her antiquated skirt. "It's a good little dress to make tea, don't you think? Don't you believe papa would allow me?" "Impossible for me to say, my child," said the Countess. "For me your father's ideas are unfathomable. Madame Merle understands them better. Ask her." Madame Merle smiled with her usual grace. "It's a weighty question. Let me think. It seems to me it would please your father to see a careful little daughter making his tea. It's the proper duty of the daughter of the house when she grows up." "So it seems to me, Madame Merle," Pansy cried. "You shall see how well I'll make it. A spoonful for each." And she began to busy herself at the table. "2 spoonfuls for me," said the Countess, who, with Madame Merle, remained for some moments watching her. "Listen to me, Pansy," the Countess resumed at last. "I should like to know what you think of your visitor." "Ah, she's not mine, she's papa's," Pansy objected. "Miss Archer came to see you as well," said Madame Merle. "I'm very happy to hear that. She has been very polite to me." "Do you like her, then?" the Countess asked. "She's charming, charming," Pansy repeated in her neat little conversational tone. "She pleases me thoroughly." "And how do you think she pleases your father?" "Ah, really, Countess," murmured Madame Merle dissuasively. "Go and call them to tea," she went on to the child. "You'll see if they don't like it," Pansy declared, and departed to summon the others, who had still lingered at the end of the terrace. "If Miss Archer's to become her mother, it's surely interesting to know if the child likes her," said the Countess. "If your brother marries again, it won't be for Pansy's sake," Madame Merle replied. "She'll soon be 16, and after that she'll begin to need a husband rather than a stepmother." "And will you provide the husband as well?" "I shall certainly take an interest in her marrying, fortunately. I imagine you'll do the same?" "Indeed I shan't!" cried the Countess. "Why should I, of all women, set such a price on a husband?" "You didn't marry fortunately. That's what I'm speaking of. When I say a husband, I mean a good one." "There are no good ones. Osmond won't be a good one." Madame Merle closed her eyes a moment. "You're irritated just now. I don't know why," she presently said. "I don't think you'll really object either to your brothers or to your niece's marrying when the time comes for them to do so. And as regards Pansy, I'm confident that we shall some day have the pleasure of looking for a husband for her together. Your large acquaintance will be a great help." "Yes, I'm irritated," the Countess answered. "You often irritate me. Your own coolness is fabulous. You're a strange woman." "It's much better that we should always act together," Madame Merle went on. "Do you mean that as a threat?" asked the Countess, rising. Madame Merle shook her head as for quiet amusement. "No, indeed. You've not my coolness." Isabel and Mr. Osmond were now slowly coming toward them, and Isabel had taken Pansy by the hand. "Do you pretend to believe he'd make her happy?" the Countess demanded. "If he should marry Miss Archer, I suppose he'd behave like a gentleman." The Countess jerked herself into a succession of attitudes. "Do you mean as most gentlemen behave? That would be much to be thankful for. Of course Osmond's a gentleman. His own sister needn't be reminded of that. But does he think he can marry any girl he happens to pick out? Osmond's a gentleman, of course, but I must say I've never, never seen any one of Osmond's pretensions. What they're all founded on is more than I can say. I'm his own sister. I might be supposed to know. Who is he, if you please? What has he ever done? If there had been anything particularly grand in his origin, if he were made of some superior clay, I presume I should have got some inkling of it. If there had been any great honours or splendours in the family, I should certainly have made the most of them. They would have been quite in my line. But there's nothing. One's parents were charming people, of course, but so were yours, no doubt. Everyone's a charming person nowadays. Even I'm a charming person. Don't laugh. It has literally been said. As for Osmond, he has always appeared to believe that he's descended from the gods." "You may say what you please," said Madame Merle, who had listened to this quick outbreak none the less attentively, we may believe, because her eye wandered away from the speaker, and her hands busied themselves with adjusting the knots of ribbon on her dress. "You Osmonds are a fine race. Your blood must flow from some very pure source. Your brother, like an intelligent man, has had the conviction of it, if he has not had the proofs. You're modest about it, but you yourself are extremely distinguished. What do you say about your niece? The child's a little princess. Nevertheless," Madame Merle added, "it won't be an easy matter for Osmond to marry Miss Archer. Yet he can try." "I hope she'll refuse him. It will take him down a little." "We mustn't forget that he is one of the cleverest of men." "I've heard you say that before, but I haven't yet discovered what he has done." "What has he done? He has done nothing that has had to be undone. And he has known how to wait." "To wait for Miss Archer's money? How much of it is there?" "That's not what I mean," said Madame Merle. "Miss Archer has £70,000." "Well, it's a pity she's so charming," the Countess declared. "To be sacrificed any girl would do. She needn't be superior." "If she weren't superior your brother would never look at her. He must have the best." "Yes," returned the Countess, as they went forward a little to meet the others. "He's very hard to satisfy. That makes me tremble for her happiness." Chapter 26. Gilbert Osmond came to see Isabel again. That is, he came to Palazzo Crescentini. He had other friends there as well, and to Mrs. Touchett and Madame Merle he was always impartially civil. But the former of these ladies noted the fact that in the course of a fortnight he called 5 times, and compared it with another fact that she found no difficulty in remembering. 2 visits a year had hitherto constituted his regular tribute to Mrs. Touchett's worth, and she had never observed him select for such visits those moments, of almost periodical recurrence, when Madame Merle was under her roof. It was not for Madame Merle that he came. These two were old friends, and he never put himself out for her. He was not fond of Ralph. Ralph had told her so. And it was not supposable that Mr. Osmond had suddenly taken a fancy to her son. Ralph was imperturbable. Ralph had a kind of loose-fitting urbanity that wrapped him about like an ill-made overcoat, but of which he never divested himself. He thought Mr. Osmond very good company, and was willing at any time to look at him in the light of hospitality. But he didn't flatter himself that the desire to repair a past injustice was the motive of their visitors' calls. He read the situation more clearly. Isabel was the attraction, and in all conscience a sufficient one. Osmond was a critic, a student of the exquisite, and it was natural he should be curious of so rare an apparition. So when his mother observed to him that it was plain what Mr. Osmond was thinking of, Ralph replied that he was quite of her opinion. Mrs. Touchett had, from far back, found a place on her scant list for this gentleman, though wondering dimly by what art and what process, so negative and so wise as they were, he had everywhere effectively imposed himself. As he had never been an importunate visitor, he had had no chance to be offensive, and he was recommended to her by his appearance of being as well able to do without her as she was to do without him, a quality that always, oddly enough, affected her as providing ground for a relation with her. It gave her no satisfaction, however, to think that he had taken it into his head to marry her niece. Such an alliance on Isabel's part would have an air of almost morbid perversity. Mrs. Touchett easily remembered that the girl had refused an English peer, and that a young lady with whom Lord Warburton had not successfully wrestled should content herself with an obscure American dilettante, a middle-aged widower with an uncanny child and an ambiguous income. This answered to nothing in Mrs. Touchett's conception of success. She took, it will be observed, not the sentimental but the political view of matrimony, a view which has always had much to recommend it. "I trust she won't have the folly to listen to him," she said to her son, to which Ralph replied that Isabel's listening was one thing and Isabel's answering quite another. He knew she had listened to several parties, as his father would have said, but had made them listen in return, and he found much entertainment in the idea that in these few months of his knowing her he should observe a fresh suitor at her gate. She had wanted to see life, and fortune was serving her to her taste. A succession of fine gentlemen going down on their knees to her would do as well as anything else. Ralph looked forward to a fourth, a fifth, a 10th besieger. He had no conviction she would stop at a third. She would keep the gate ajar and open a parley. She would certainly not allow number 3 to come in. He expressed this view, somewhat after this fashion, to his mother, who looked at him as if he had been dancing in a jig. He had such a fanciful, pictorial way of saying things that he might as well address her in the deaf-mute's alphabet. "I don't think I know what you mean," she said. "You use too many figures of speech. I could never understand allegories. The two words in the language I most respect are yes and no. If Isabel wants to marry Mr. Osmond, she'll do so in spite of all your comparisons. Let her alone to find a fine one herself for anything she undertakes. I know very little about the young man in America. I don't think she spends much of her time in thinking of him, and I suspect he has got tired of waiting for her. There's nothing in life to prevent her marrying Mr. Osmond if she only looks at him in a certain way. That's all very well. No one approves more than I of one's pleasing oneself. But she takes her pleasure in such odd things. She's capable of marrying Mr. Osmond for the beauty of his opinions, or for his autograph of Michelangelo. She wants to be disinterested, as if she were the only person who's in danger of not being so. Will he be so disinterested when he has the spending of her money? That was her idea before your father's death, and it has acquired new charms for her since. She ought to marry some one of whose disinterestedness she shall herself be sure, and there would be no such proof of that as his having a fortune of his own." "My dear mother, I'm not afraid," Ralph answered. "She's making fools of us all. She'll please herself, of course, but she'll do so by studying human nature at close quarters, and yet retaining her liberty. She has started out on an exploring expedition, and I don't think she'll change her course at the outset at a signal from Gilbert Osmond. She may have slackened speed for an hour, but before we know it she'll be steaming away again. Excuse another metaphor." Mrs. Touchett excused it perhaps, but was not so much reassured as to withhold from Madame Merle the expression of her fears. "You who know everything," she said, "you must know this, whether that curious creature's really making love to my niece." "Gilbert Osmond?" Madame Merle widened her clear eyes, and, with a full intelligence, "Heaven help us!" she exclaimed. "That's an idea!" "Hadn't it occurred to you?" "You make me feel an idiot, but I confess it hadn't. I wonder," she added, "if it has occurred to Isabel." "Oh, I shall now ask her," said Mrs. Touchett. Madame Merle reflected. "Don't put it into her head. The thing would be to ask Mr. Osmond." "I can't do that," said Mrs. Touchett. "I won't have him inquire of me, as he perfectly may with that air of his, given Isabel's situation, what business it is of mine." "I'll ask him myself," Madame Merle bravely declared. "But what business, for him, is it of yours?" "It's being done whatever is just why I can afford to speak. It's so much less my business than any one's else that he can put me off with anything he chooses. But it will be by the way he does this that I shall know." "Pray let me hear then," said Mrs. Touchett, "of the fruits of your penetration. If I can't speak to him, however, at least I can speak to Isabel." Her companion sounded at this the note of warning. "Don't be too quick with her. Don't inflame her imagination." "I never did anything in my life to any one's imagination. But I'm always sure of her doing something, well, not of my kind." "No, you wouldn't like this," Madame Merle observed, without the point of interrogation. "Why in the world should I, pray? Mr. Osmond has nothing the least solid to offer." Again Madame Merle was silent, while her thoughtful smile drew up her mouth even more charmingly than usual toward the left corner. "Let us distinguish. Gilbert Osmond's certainly not the first comer. He's a man who in favourable conditions might very well make a great impression. He has made a great impression, to my knowledge, more than once." "Don't tell me about his probably quite cold-blooded love affairs. They're nothing to me," Mrs. Touchett cried. "What you say's precisely why I wish he would cease his visits. He has nothing in the world that I know of but a dozen or two of early masters and a more or less pert little daughter." "The early masters are now worth a good deal of money," said Madame Merle, "and the daughter's a very young and very innocent and very harmless person." "In other words, she's an insipid little chit, is that what you mean? Having no fortune she can't hope to marry as they marry here, so that Isabel will have to furnish her either with the maintenance or with the dowry." "Isabel probably wouldn't object to being kind to her. I think she likes the poor child." "Another reason, then, for Mr. Osmond's stopping at home. Otherwise, a week hence, we shall have my niece arriving at the conviction that her mission in life's to prove that a step-mother may sacrifice herself, and that to prove it she must first become one." "She would make a charming step-mother," smiled Madame Merle. "But I quite agree with you that she had better not decide upon her mission too hastily. Changing the form of one's mission's almost as difficult as changing the shape of one's nose. There they are, each, in the middle of one's face and one's character. One has to begin too far back. But I'll investigate and report to you." All this went on quite over Isabel's head. She had no suspicions that her relations with Mr. Osmond were being discussed. Madame Merle had said nothing to put her on her guard. She alluded no more pointedly to him than to the other gentlemen of Florence, native and foreign, who now arrived in considerable numbers to pay their respects to Miss Archer's aunt. Isabel thought him interesting. She came back to that. She liked so to think of him. She had carried away an image from her visit to his hilltop which her subsequent knowledge of him did nothing to efface, and which put on for her a particular harmony with other supposed and divined things, histories within histories, the image of a quiet, clever, sensitive, distinguished man strolling on a moss-grown terrace above the sweet Val d'Arno, and holding by the hand a little girl whose bell-like clearness gave a new grace to childhood. The picture had no flourishes, but she liked its lowness of tone and the atmosphere of summer twilight that pervaded it. It spoke of the kind of personal issues that touched her most nearly, of the choice between objects, subjects, contacts, what might she call them, of a thin and those of a rich association, of a lonely studious life in a lovely land, of an old sorrow that sometimes ached today, of a feeling of pride that was perhaps exaggerated, but that had an element of nobleness, of a care for beauty and perfection so natural and so cultivated together that the career appeared to stretch beneath it in the disposed vistas and with the ranges of steps and terraces and fountains of a formal Italian garden, allowing only for arid places freshened by the natural dews of a quaint, half-anxious, half-helpless fatherhood. At Palazzo Crescentini, Mr. Osmond's manner remained the same, diffident at first, self-conscious beyond doubt, and full of the effort, visible only to a sympathetic eye, to overcome this disadvantage, an effort which usually resulted in a great deal of easy, lively, very positive, rather aggressive, always suggestive talk. Mr. Osmond's talk was not injured by the indication of an eagerness to shine. Isabel found no difficulty in believing that a person was sincere who had so many of the signs of strong conviction, as, for instance, an explicit and graceful appreciation of anything that might be said on his own side of the question, and perhaps by Miss Archer in special. What continued to please this young woman was that while he talked so for amusement, he didn't talk, as she had heard people, for effect. He uttered his ideas as if, odd as they often appeared, he were used to them and had lived with them, old polished knobs and heads and handles of freshest substance that could be fitted, if necessary, to new walking-sticks, not switches plucked in destitution from the common tree and then too elegantly waved about. One day he brought his small daughter with him, and she rejoiced to renew acquaintance with the child, who, as she presented her forehead to be kissed by every member of the circle, reminded her vividly of an ingénue in a French play. Isabel had never seen a little person of this pattern. American girls were very different. Different, too, were the maidens of England. Pansy was so formed and finished for her tiny place in the world, and yet in imagination, as one could see, so innocent and infantine. She sat on the sofa by Isabel. She wore a small grenadine mantle and a pair of the useful gloves that Madame Merle had given her, little grey gloves with a single button. She was like a sheet of blank paper, the ideal jeune fille of foreign fiction. Isabel hoped that so fair and smooth a page would be covered with an edifying text. The Countess Jemimy also came to call upon her, but the Countess was quite another affair. She was by no means a blank sheet. She had been written over in a variety of hands, and Mrs. Touchett, who felt by no means honoured by her visit, pronounced that a number of unmistakable blots were to be seen upon her surface. The Countess gave rise indeed to some discussion between the mistress of the house and the visitor from Rome, in which Madame Merle, who was not such a fool as to irritate people by always agreeing with them, availed herself felicitously enough of that large licence of dissent which her hostess permitted as freely as she practised it. Mrs. Touchett had declared it a piece of audacity that this highly compromised character should have presented herself at such a time of day at the door of a house in which she was esteemed so little as she must long have known herself to be at Palazzo Crescentini. Isabel had been made acquainted with the estimate prevailing under that roof. It represented Mr. Osmond's sister as a lady who had so mismanaged her improprieties that they had ceased to hang together at all, which was at the least what one asked of such matters, and had become the mere floating fragments of a wrecked renown, incommoding social circulation. She had been married by her mother, a more administrative person, with an appreciation of foreign titles which the daughter, to do her justice, had probably by this time thrown off, to an Italian nobleman who had perhaps given her some excuse for attempting to quench the consciousness of outrage. The Countess, however, had consoled herself outrageously, and the list of her excuses had now lost itself in the labyrinth of her adventures. Mrs. Touchett had never consented to receive her, though the Countess had made overtures of old. Florence was not an austere city, but, as Mrs. Touchett said, she had to draw the line somewhere. Madame Merle defended the luckless lady with a great deal of zeal and wit. She couldn't see why Mrs. Touchett should make a scapegoat of a woman who had really done no harm, who had only done good in the wrong way. One must certainly draw the line, but while one was about it, one should draw it straight. It was a very crooked chalk mark that would exclude the Countess Jemini. In that case, Mrs. Touchett had better shut up her house. This perhaps would be the best course so long as she remained in Florence. One must be fair and not make arbitrary differences. The Countess had doubtless been imprudent. She had not been so clever as other women. She was a good creature, not clever at all. But since when had that been a ground of exclusion from the best society? For ever so long now one had heard nothing about her, and there could be no better proof of her having renounced the error of her ways than her desire to become a member of Mrs. Touchett's circle. Isabel could contribute nothing to this interesting dispute, not even a patient attention. She contented herself with having given a friendly welcome to the unfortunate lady, who, whatever her defects, had at least the merit of being Mr. Osmond's sister. As she liked the brother, Isabel thought it proper to try and like the sister. In spite of the growing complexity of things, she was still capable of these primitive sequences. She had not received the happiest impression of the Countess on meeting her at the villa, but was thankful for an opportunity to repair the accident. Had not Mr. Osmond remarked that she was a respectable person? To have proceeded from Gilbert Osmond, this was a crude proposition, but Madame Merle bestowed upon it a certain improving polish. She told Isabel more about the poor Countess than Mr. Osmond had done, and related the history of her marriage and its consequences. The Count was a member of an ancient Tuscan family, but of such small estate that he had been glad to accept Amy Osmond, in spite of the questionable beauty which had not yet hampered her career, with the modest dowry her mother was able to offer, a sum about equivalent to that which had already formed her brother's share of their patrimony. Count Jemini since then, however, had inherited money, and now they were well enough off, as Italians went, though Amy was horribly extravagant. The Count was a low-lived brute. He had given his wife every pretext. She had no children, she had lost 3 within a year of their birth. Her mother, who had bristled with pretensions to elegant learning, and published descriptive poems and corresponded on Italian subjects with the English weekly journals, her mother had died 3 years after the Countess's marriage. The father, lost in the grey American dawn of the situation, but reputed originally rich and wild, having died much earlier. One could see this in Gilbert Osmond, Madame Merle held, see that he had been brought up by a woman, though, to do him justice, one would suppose it had been by a more sensible woman than the American Corinne, as Mrs. Osmond had liked to be called. She had brought her children to Italy after her husband's death, and Mrs. Touchett remembered her during the year that followed her arrival. She thought her a horrible snob, but this was an irregularity of judgment on Mrs. Touchett's part, for she, like Mrs. Osmond, approved of political marriages. The Countess was very good company, and not really the featherhead she seemed. All one had to do with her was to observe the simple condition of not believing a word she said. Madame Merle had always made the best of her for her brother's sake. He appreciated any kindness shown to Amy, because, if it had to be confessed for him, he rather felt she let down their common name. Naturally, he couldn't like her style, her shrillness, her egotism, her violations of taste, and above all of truth. She acted badly on his nerves. She was not his sort of woman. What was his sort of woman? Oh, the very opposite of the Countess, a woman to whom the truth should be habitually sacred. Isabel was unable to estimate the number of times her visitor had, in half an hour, profaned it. The Countess, indeed, had given her an impression of rather silly sincerity. She had talked almost exclusively about herself, how much she should like to know Miss Archer, how thankful she should be for a real friend, how base the people in Florence were, how tired she was of the place, how much she would like to live somewhere else, in Paris, in London, in Washington, how impossible it was to get anything nice to wear in Italy, except a little old lace, how dear the world was growing everywhere, what a life of suffering and privation she had led. Madame Merle listened with interest to Isabel's account of this passage, but she had not needed it to feel exempt from anxiety. On the whole, she was not afraid of the Countess, and she could afford to do what was altogether best, not to appear so. Isabel had meanwhile another visitor, whom it was not, even behind her back, so easy a matter to patronise. Henrietta Stackpole, who had left Paris after Mrs. Touchett's departure for San Remo, and had worked her way down, as she said, through the cities of North Italy, reached the banks of the Arno about the middle of May. Madame Merle surveyed her with a single glance, took her in from head to foot, and after a pang of despair determined to endure her. She had determined, indeed, to delight in her. She mightn't be inhaled as a rose, but she might be grasped as a nettle. Madame Merle genially squeezed her into insignificance, and Isabel felt that in foreseeing this liberality she had done justice to her friend's intelligence. Henrietta's arrival had been announced by Mr. Bantling, who, coming down from Nice while she was at Venice, and expecting to find her in Florence, which he had not yet reached, called at the Palazzo Crescentini to express his disappointment. Henrietta's own advent occurred 2 days later, and produced in Mr. Bantling an emotion amply accounted for by the fact that he had not seen her since the termination of the episode at Versailles. The humorous view of his situation was generally taken, but it was uttered only by Ralph Touchett, who, in the privacy of his own apartment, when Bantling smoked a cigar there, indulged in goodness knew what strong comedy on the subject of the all-judging one and her British backer. This gentleman took the joke in perfectly good part, and candidly confessed that he regarded the affair as a positive intellectual adventure. He liked Miss Stackpole extremely. He thought she had a wonderful head on her shoulders, and found great comfort in the society of a woman who was not perpetually thinking about what would be said, and how what she did, how what they did, and they had done things, would look. Miss Stackpole never cared how anything looked, and if she didn't care, pray, why should he? But his curiosity had been roused. He wanted awfully to see if she ever would care. He was prepared to go as far as she. He didn't see why he should break down first. Henrietta showed no signs of breaking down. Her prospects had brightened on her leaving England, and she was now in the full enjoyment of her copious resources. She had indeed been obliged to sacrifice her hopes with regard to the inner life. The social question on the Continent bristled with difficulties even more numerous than those she had encountered in England. But on the Continent there was the outer life, which was palpable and visible at every turn, and more easily convertible to literary uses than the customs of those opaque islanders. Out of doors in foreign lands, as she ingeniously remarked, one seemed to see the right side of the tapestry. Out of doors in England one seemed to see the wrong side, which gave one no notion of the figure. The admission cost her historian a pang, but Henrietta, despairing of more occult things, was now paying much attention to the outer life. She had been studying it for 2 months at Venice, from which city she sent to the interviewer a conscientious account of the gondolas, the piazza, the Bridge of Sighs, the pigeons, and the young boatman who chanted Tasso. The interviewer was perhaps disappointed, but Henrietta was at least seeing Europe. Her present purpose was to get down to Rome before the malaria should come on. She apparently supposed that it began on a fixed day. And with this design she was to spend at present but few days in Florence. Mr. Bantling was to go with her to Rome, and she pointed out to Isabel that as he had been there before, as he was a military man, and as he had had a classical education, he had been bred at Eton, where they study nothing but Latin and white Melville, said Miss Stackpole, he would be a most useful companion in the city of the Caesars. At this juncture Ralph had the happy idea of proposing to Isabel that she also, under his own escort, should make a pilgrimage to Rome. She expected to pass a portion of the next winter there. That was very well. But meantime there was no harm in surveying the field. There were 10 days left of the beautiful month of May, the most precious month of all to the true Rome lover. Isabel would become a Rome lover. That was a foregone conclusion. She was provided with a trusty companion of her own sex, whose society, thanks to the fact of other calls on this lady's attention, would probably not be oppressive. Madame Merle would remain with Mrs. Touchett. She had left Rome for the summer and wouldn't care to return. She professed herself delighted to be left at peace in Florence. She had locked up her apartment and sent her cook home to Palestrina. She urged Isabel, however, to assent to Ralph's proposal, and assured her that a good introduction to Rome was not a thing to be despised. Isabel, in truth, needed no urging, and the party of 4 arranged its little journey. Mrs. Touchett, on this occasion, had resigned herself to the absence of a duenna. We have seen that she now inclined to the belief that her niece should stand alone. One of Isabel's preparations consisted of her seeing Gilbert Osmond before she started, and mentioning her intention to him. "I should like to be in Rome with you," he commented. "I should like to see you on that wonderful ground." She scarcely faltered. "You might come, then." "But you'll have a lot of people with you." "Ah," Isabel admitted, "of course I shall not be alone." For a moment he said nothing more. "You'll like it," he went on at last. "They've spoiled it, but you'll rave about it." "Ought I to dislike it because, poor old dear, the Niobe of nations, you know, it has been spoiled?" she asked. "No, I think not. It has been spoiled so often," he smiled. "If I were to go, what should I do with my little girl?" "Can't you leave her at the villa?" "I don't know that I like that, though there's a very good old woman who looks after her. I can't afford a governess." "Bring her with you, then," said Isabel promptly. Mr. Osmond looked grave. "She has been in Rome all winter at her convent, and she's too young to make journeys of pleasure." "You don't like bringing her forward?" Isabel inquired. "No, I think young girls should be kept out of the world." "I was brought up on a different system." "You? Oh, with you it succeeded, because you were exceptional." "I don't see why," said Isabel, who, however, was not sure there was not some truth in the speech. Mr. Osmond didn't explain. He simply went on. "If I thought it would make her resemble you to join a social group in Rome, I'd take her there to morrow." "Don't make her resemble me," said Isabel. "Keep her like herself." "I might send her to my sister," Mr. Osmond observed. He had almost the air of asking advice. He seemed to like to talk over his domestic matters with Miss Archer. "Yes," she concurred. "I think that wouldn't do much towards making her resemble me." After she had left Florence, Gilbert Osmond met Madame Merle at the Countess Jeminie's. There were other people present. The Countess's drawing room was usually well filled, and the talk had been general, but after a while Osmond left his place and came and sat on an ottoman half behind, half beside Madame Merle's chair. "She wants me to go to Rome with her," he remarked in a low voice. "To go with her?" To be there while she's there. She proposed it." "I suppose you mean that you proposed it and she assented." "Of course I gave her a chance. But she's encouraging. She's very encouraging." "I rejoice to hear it. But don't cry victory too soon. Of course you'll go to Rome." "Ah," said Osmond, "it makes one work, this idea of yours." "Don't pretend you don't enjoy it. You're very ungrateful. You've not been so well occupied these many years." "The way you take 'It's beautiful,'" said Osmond. "I ought to be grateful for that." "Not too much so, however," Madame Merle answered. She talked with her usual smile, leaning back in her chair and looking around the room. "You've made a very good impression, and I've seen for myself that you've received one. You've not come to Mrs. Touchett's 7 times to oblige me." "The girl's not disagreeable," Osmond quietly conceded. Madame Merle dropped her eye on him a moment, during which her lips closed with a certain firmness. "Is that all you can find to say about that fine creature?" "All? Isn't it enough? Of how many people have you heard me say more?" She made no answer to this, but still presented her talkative grace to the room. "You're unfathomable," she murmured at last. "I'm frightened at the abyss into which I shall have to cast her." He took it almost gaily. "You can't draw back. You've gone too far." "Very good. But you must do the rest yourself." "I shall do it," said Gilbert Osmond. Madame Merle remained silent, and he changed his place again, but when she rose to go he also took leave. Mrs. Touchett's Victoria was awaiting her guest in the court, and after he had helped his friend into it he stood there detaining her. "You're very indiscreet," she said rather wearily. "You shouldn't have moved when I did." He had taken off his hat. He passed his hand over his forehead. "I always forget. I'm out of the habit." "You're quite unfathomable," she repeated, glancing up at the windows of the house, a modern structure in the new part of town. He paid no heed to this remark, but spoke in his own sense. "She's really very charming. I've scarcely known any one more graceful." "It does me good to hear you say that. The better you like her, the better for me." "I like her very much. She's all you described her, and into the bargain capable, I feel, of great devotion. She has only one fault." "What's that?" "Too many ideas." "I warned you she was clever." "Fortunately they're very bad ones," said Osmond. "Why is that fortunate?" "Dam, if they must be sacrificed." Madame Merle leaned back, looking straight before her. Then she spoke to the coachman. But her friend again detained her. "If I go to Rome, what shall I do with Pansy?" "I'll go and see her," said Madame Merle. Chapter 27. Of the Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. This LibriVox is in the public domain. I may not attempt to report in its fulness our young woman's response to the deep appeal of Rome, to analyse her feelings as she trod the pavement of the Forum, or to number her pulsations as she crossed the threshold of St. Peter's. It is enough to say that her impression was such as might have been expected of a person of her freshness and her eagerness. She had always been fond of history, and here was history in the stones of the street and the atoms of the sunshine. She had an imagination that kindled at the mention of great deeds, and wherever she turned some great deed had been acted. These things strongly moved her, but moved her all inwardly. It seemed to her companions that she talked less than usual, and Ralph Touchett, when he appeared to be looking listlessly and awkwardly over her head, was really dropping on her an intensity of observation. By her own measure she was very happy. She would even have been willing to take these hours for the happiest she was ever to know. The sense of the terrible human past was heavy to her, but that of something altogether contemporary would suddenly give it wings that it could wave in the blue. Her consciousness was so mixed that she scarcely knew where the different parts of it would lead her, and she went about in a repressed ecstasy of contemplation, seeing often in the things she looked at a great deal more than was there, and yet not seeing many of the items enumerated in her Murray. Rome, as Ralph said, confessed to the psychological moment. The herd of re-echoing tourists had departed, and most of the solemn places had relapsed into solemnity. The sky was a blaze of blue, and the plash of the fountains in their mossy niches had lost its chill and doubled its music. On the corners of the warm, bright streets one stumbled on bundles of flowers. Our friends had gone one afternoon (it was the third of their stay) to look at the latest excavations in the Forum, these labours having been for some time previously largely extended. They had descended from the modern street to the level of the sacred way, along which they wandered with a reverence of step which was not the same on the part of each. Henrietta Stackpole was struck with the fact that ancient Rome had been paved a good deal like New York, and even found an analogy between the deep chariot ruts traceable in the antique street and the over-jangled iron grooves which express the intensity of American life. The sun had begun to sink, the air was a golden haze, and the long shadows of broken column and vague pedestal leaned across the field of ruin. Henrietta wandered away with Mr. Bantling, whom it was apparently delightful to her to hear speak of Julius Caesar as a cheeky old boy, and Ralph addressed such elucidations as he was prepared to offer to the attentive ear of our heroine. One of the humble archaeologists who hover about the place had put himself at the disposal of the two, and repeated his lesson with a fluency which the decline of the season had done nothing to impair. A process of digging was on view in a remote corner of the Forum, and he presently remarked that if it should please the signori to go and watch it a little, they might see something of interest. The proposal commended itself more to Ralph than to Isabel, weary with much wandering, so that she admonished her companion to satisfy his curiosity while she patiently awaited his return. The hour and the place were much to her taste. She should enjoy being briefly alone. Ralph accordingly went off with the cicerone, while Isabel sat down on a prostrate column near the foundations of the Capitol. She wanted a short solitude, but she was not long to enjoy it. Keen as was her interest in the rugged relics of the Roman past that lay scattered about her, and in which the corrosion of centuries had still left so much of individual life, her thoughts, after resting a while on these things, had wandered, by a concatenation of stages it might require some subtlety to trace, to regions and objects charged with a more active appeal. From the Roman past to Isabel Archer's future was a long stride, but her imagination had taken it in a single flight, and now hovered in slow circles over the nearer and richer field. She was so absorbed in her thoughts, as she bent her eyes upon a row of cracked but not dislocated slabs covering the ground at her feet, that she had not heard the sound of approaching footsteps before a shadow was thrown across the line of her vision. She looked up and saw a gentleman who was not Ralph come back to say that the excavations were a bore. This personage was startled as she was startled. He stood there baring his head to her perceptibly pale surprise. "Lord Warburton!" Isabel exclaimed as she rose. "I had no idea it was you. I turned that corner and came upon you." She looked about her to explain. "I'm alone, but my companions have just left me. My cousin's gone to look at the work over there." "Ah, yes, I see." And Lord Warburton's eyes wandered vaguely in the direction she had indicated. He stood firmly before her now. He had recovered his balance, and seemed to wish to show it, though very kindly. "Don't let me disturb you," he went on, looking at her dejected pillar. "I'm afraid you're tired." "Yes, I'm rather tired." She hesitated a moment, but sat down again. "Don't let me interrupt you," she added. "Oh, dear, I'm quite alone. I've nothing on earth to do. I had no idea you were in Rome. I've just come from the East. I'm only passing through." "You've been making a long journey," said Isabel, who had learned from Ralph that Lord Warburton was absent from England. "Yes, I came abroad for 6 months, soon after I saw you last. I've been in Turkey and Asia Minor. I came the other day from Athens." He managed not to be awkward, but he wasn't easy, and after a longer look at the girl he came down to nature. "Do you wish me to leave you, or will you let me stay a little?" She took it all humanely. "I don't wish you to leave me, Lord Warburton. I'm very glad to see you." "Thank you for saying that. May I sit down?" The fluted shaft on which she had taken her seat would have afforded a resting place to several persons, and there was plenty of room even for a highly developed Englishman. This fine specimen of that great class seated himself near our young lady, and in the course of 5 minutes he had asked her several questions, taken rather at random, and to which, as he put some of them twice over, he apparently somewhat missed catching the answer; had given her too some information about himself which was not wasted upon her calmer feminine sense. He repeated more than once that he had not expected to meet her, and it was evident that the encounter touched him in a way that would have made preparation advisable. He began abruptly to pass from the impunity of things to their solemnity, and from their being delightful to their being impossible. He was splendidly sunburned; even his multitudinous beard had been burnished by the fire of Asia. He was dressed in the loose-fitting, heterogeneous garments in which the English traveller in foreign lands is wont to consult his comfort and affirm his nationality; and with his pleasant steady eyes, his bronzed complexion, fresh beneath its seasoning, his manly figure, his minimising manner, and his general air of being a gentleman and an explorer, he was such a representative of the British race as need not in any clime have been disavowed by those who have a kindness for it. Isabel noted these things, and was glad she had always liked him. He had kept, evidently, in spite of shocks, every one of his merits; properties, these partaking of the essence of great decent houses, as one might put it, resembling their innermost fixtures and ornaments, not subject to vulgar shifting and removable only by some whole break-up. They talked of the matters naturally in order: her uncle's death, Ralph's state of health, the way she had passed her winter, her visit to Rome, her return to Florence, her plans for the summer, the hotel she was staying at; and then of Lord Warburton's own adventures, movements, intentions, impressions, and present domicile. At last there was a silence, and it said so much more than either had said that it scarce needed his final words. "I've written to you several times." "Written to me? I've never had your letters." "I never sent them. I burned them up." "Ah!" laughed Isabel. "It was better that you should do that than I." "I thought you wouldn't care for them," he went on, with a simplicity that touched her. "It seemed to me that after all I had no right to trouble you with letters." "I should have been very glad to have news of you. You know how I hoped that—" But she stopped. There would be such a flatness in the utterance of her thought. "I know what you are going to say. You hoped we should always remain good friends." This formula, as Lord Warburton uttered it, was certainly flat enough; but then he was interested in making it appear so. She found herself reduced simply to "Please don't talk of all that," a speech which hardly struck her as improvement on the other. "It's a small consolation to allow me," her companion exclaimed with force. "I can't pretend to console you," said the girl, who, all still as she sat there, threw herself back with a sort of inward triumph on the answer that had satisfied him so little 6 months before. He was pleasant, he was powerful, he was gallant; there was no better man than he. but her answer remained. "It's very well you don't try to console me. It wouldn't be in your power," she heard him say through the medium of her strange elation. "I hoped we should meet again because I had no fear you would attempt to make me feel I had wronged you. But when you do that, the pain's greater than the pleasure." And she got up with a small conscious majesty, looking for her companions. "I don't want to make you feel that. Of course I can't say that. I only just want you to know one or two things, in fairness to myself, as it were. I won't return to the subject again. I felt very strongly what I expressed to you last year. I couldn't think of anything else. I tried to forget, energetically, systematically. I tried to take an interest in somebody else. I tell you this because I want you to know I did my duty. I didn't succeed. It was for the same purpose I went abroad, as far away as possible. They say travelling distracts the mind, but it didn't distract mine. I've thought of you perpetually ever since I last saw you. I'm exactly the same. I love you just as much, and everything I said to you then is just as true. This instant at which I speak to you shows me again exactly how, to my great misfortune, you just insuperably charm me. There, I can't say less. I don't mean, however, to insist. It's only for a moment. I may add that when I came upon you a few minutes since, without the smallest idea of seeing you, I was, upon my honour, in the very act of wishing I knew where you were." He had recovered his self-control, and while he spoke it became complete. He might have been addressing a small committee, making all quietly and clearly a statement of importance, aided by an occasional look at a paper of notes concealed in his hat, which he had not again put on. And the committee, assuredly, would have felt the point proved. "I've often thought of you, Lord Warburton," Isabel answered. "You may be sure I shall always do that." And she added in a tone of which she tried to keep up the kindness and keep down the meaning, "There's no harm in that on either side." They walked along together, and she was prompt to ask about his sisters and request him to let them know she had done so. He made for the moment no further reference to their great question, but dipped again into shallower and safer waters. But he wished to know when she was to leave Rome, and on her mentioning the limit of her stay, declared he was glad it was still so distant. "Why do you say that, if you yourself are only passing through?" she inquired with some anxiety. "Ah, when I said I was passing through, I didn't mean that one would treat Rome as if it were Clapham Junction. To pass through Rome is to stop a week or two." "Say frankly that you mean to stay as long as I do." His flushed smile for a little seemed to sound her. "You wouldn't like that. You're afraid you'll see too much of me." "It doesn't matter what I like. I certainly can't expect you to leave this delightful place on my account. But I confess I'm afraid of you." "Afraid I'll begin again? I promise to be very careful." They had gradually stopped, and they stood for a moment face to face. "Poor Lord Warburton," she said with a compassion intended to be good for both of them. "Poor Lord Warburton, indeed! But I'll be careful." "You may be unhappy, but you shall not make me so. That I can't allow." "If I believed I could make you unhappy, I think I should try it." At this she walked in advance, and he also proceeded. "I'll never say a word to displease you." "Very good. If you do, our friendship's at an end." "Perhaps some day, after a while, you'll give me leave." "Give you leave to make me unhappy?" He hesitated. "To tell you again," but he checked himself. "I'll keep it down. I'll keep it down always." Ralph Touchett had been joined in his visit to the excavation by Miss Stackpole and her attendant, and these three now emerged from among the mounds of earth and stone collected round the aperture and came into sight of Isabel and her companion. Poor Ralph hailed his friend with joy qualified by wonder, and Henrietta exclaimed in a high voice, "Gracious, there's that lord!" Ralph and his English neighbour, greeted with the austerity with which, after long separation, English neighbours greet, and Miss Stackpole rested her large intellectual gaze upon the sunburnt traveller. But she soon established her relation to the crisis. "I don't suppose you remember me, sir?" "Indeed I do remember you," said Lord Warburton. "I asked you to come and see me, and you never came." "I don't go everywhere I'm asked," Miss Stackpole answered coldly. "Ah, well, I won't ask you again," laughed the Master of Lockleigh. "If you do, I'll go, so be sure." Lord Warburton, for all his hilarity, seemed sure enough. Mr. Bantling had stood by without claiming a recognition, but he now took occasion to nod to his lordship, who answered him with a friendly "Oh, you here, Bantling?" and a handshake. "Well," said Henrietta, "I didn't know you knew him." "I guess you don't know every one I know," Mr. Bantling rejoined facetiously. "I thought that when an Englishman knew a lord he always told you." "Ah, I'm afraid Bantling was ashamed of me," Lord Warburton laughed again. Isabel took pleasure in that note; she gave a small sigh of relief as they kept their course homeward. The next day was Sunday. She spent her morning over 2 long letters, one to her sister Lily, the other to Madame Merle, but in neither of these epistles did she mention the fact that a rejected suitor had threatened her with another appeal. Of a Sunday afternoon all good Romans, and the best Romans are often the northern barbarians, follow the custom of going to vespers at St. Peter's, and it had been agreed among our friends that they would drive together to the great church. After lunch, an hour before the carriage came, Lord Warburton presented himself at the Hotel de Paris, and paid a visit to the 2 ladies, Ralph Touchett and Mr. Bantling having gone out together. The visitor seemed to have wished to give Isabel a proof of his intention to keep the promise made her the evening before. He was both discreet and frank, not even dumbly importunate or remotely intense. He thus left her to judge what a mere good friend he could be. He talked about his travels, about Persia, about Turkey, and when Miss Stackpole asked him whether it would pay for her to visit those countries, assured her that they offered a great field to female enterprise. Isabel did him justice, but she wondered what his purpose was, and what he expected to gain even by proving the superior strain of his sincerity. If he expected to melt her by showing what a good fellow he was, he might spare himself the trouble. She knew the superior strain of everything about him, and nothing he could now do was required to light the view. Moreover, his being in Rome at all affected her as a complication of the wrong sort; she liked so complications of the right. Nevertheless, when, on bringing his call to a close, he said he too should be at St. Peter's, and should look out for her and her friends, she was obliged to reply that he must follow his convenience. In the church, as she strolled over its tessellated acres, he was the first person she encountered. She had not been one of the superior tourists who are disappointed in St. Peter's, and find it smaller than its fame. The first time she passed beneath the huge leathern curtain that strains and bangs at the entrance, the first time she found herself beneath the far-arching dome, and saw the light drizzle down through the air thickened with incense and with the reflections of marble and gilt, of mosaic and bronze, her conception of greatness rose and dizzily rose. After this it never lacked space to soar. She gazed and wondered like a child or a peasant. She paid her silent tribute to the seated sublime. Lord Warburton walked beside her, and talked of Saint Sophia of Constantinople. She feared, for instance, that he would end by calling attention to his exemplary conduct. The service had not yet begun, but at St. Peter's there is much to observe, and as there is something almost profane in the vastness of the place, which seems meant as much for physical as for spiritual exercise, the different figures and groups, the mingled worshippers and spectators, may follow their various intentions without conflict or scandal. In that splendid immensity, individual indiscretion carries but a short distance. Isabel and her companions, however, were guilty of none; for though Henrietta was obliged in candour to declare that Michelangelo's dome suffered by comparison with that of the Capitol at Washington, she addressed her protest chiefly to Mr. Bantling's ear, and reserved it in its more accentuated form for the columns of the Interviewer. Isabel made the circuit of the church with his lordship, and as they drew near the choir on the left of the entrance, the voices of the Pope's singers were borne to them over the heads of the large number of persons clustered outside the doors. They paused a while on the skirts of this crowd, composed in equal measure of Roman cockneys and inquisitive strangers, and while they stood there the sacred concert went forward. Ralph, with Henrietta and Mr. Bantling, was apparently within, where Isabel, looking beyond the dense group in front of her, saw the afternoon light, silvered by clouds of incense that seemed to mingle with the splendid chant, slope through the embossed recesses of high windows. After a while the singing stopped, and then Lord Warburton seemed disposed to move off with her. Isabel could only accompany him, whereupon she found herself confronted with Gilbert Osmond, who appeared to have been standing at a short distance behind her. He now approached with all the forms; he appeared to have multiplied them on this occasion to suit this place. "So you decided to come," she said, as she put out her hand. "Yes, I came last night, and called this afternoon at your hotel. They told me you had come here, and I looked about for you." "The others are inside," she decided to say. "I didn't come for the others," he promptly returned. She looked away. Lord Warburton was watching them. Perhaps he had heard this. Suddenly she remembered it to be just what he had said to her the morning he came to Gardencourt to ask her to marry him. Mr. Osmond's words had brought the colour to her cheek, and this reminiscence had not the effect of dispelling it. She repaired any betrayal by mentioning to each companion the name of the other, and fortunately at this moment Mr. Bantling emerged from the choir, cleaving the crowd with British valour, and followed by Miss Stackpole and Ralph Touchett. I say fortunately, but this is perhaps a superficial view of the matter, since on perceiving the gentleman from Florence, Ralph Touchett appeared to take the case as not committing him to joy. He didn't hang back, however, from civility, and presently observed to Isabel, with due benevolence, that she would soon have all her friends about her. Miss Stackpole had met Mr. Osmond in Florence, but she had already found occasion to say to Isabel that she liked him no better than her other admirers, than Mr. Touchett and Lord Warburton, and even than little Mr. Rosier in Paris. "I don't know what it's in you," she had been pleased to remark, "but for a nice girl you do attract the most unnatural people. Mr. Goodwood's the only one I've any respect for, and he's just the one you don't appreciate." "What's your opinion of St. Peter's?" Mr. Osmond was meanwhile inquiring of our young lady. "It's very large and very bright," she contented herself with replying. "It's too large. It makes one feel like an atom." "Isn't that the right way to feel in the greatest of human temples?" she asked with rather a liking for her phrase. "I suppose it's the right way to feel everywhere, when one is nobody. But I like it in a church as little as anywhere else." "You ought indeed to be a pope," Isabel exclaimed, remembering something he had referred to in Florence. "Ah, I should have enjoyed that," said Gilbert Osmond. Lord Warburton, meanwhile, had joined Ralph Touchett, and the two strolled away together. "Who's the fellow speaking to Miss Archer?" his lordship demanded. "His name's Gilbert Osmond. He lives in Florence," Ralph said. "What is he besides?" "Nothing at all. Oh, yes, he's an American, but one forgets that. He's so little of one." "Has he known Miss Archer long?" "3 or 4 weeks." "Does she like him?" "She's trying to find out." "And will she?" "Find out?" Ralph asked. "Will she like him?" "Do you mean will she accept him?" "Yes," said Lord Warburton after an instant. "I suppose that's what I horribly mean." "Perhaps not if one does nothing to prevent it," Ralph replied. His lordship stared a moment, but apprehended. "Then we must be perfectly quiet?" "As quiet as the grave, and only on the chance," Ralph added. "The chance she may——" "The chance she may not?" Lord Warburton took this at first in silence, but he spoke again. "Is he awfully clever?" "Awfully," said Ralph. His companion thought. "And what else?" "What more do you want?" Ralph groaned. "Do you mean what more does she?" Ralph took him by the arm to turn him. They had to rejoin the others. "She wants nothing that we can give her." "Ah, well, if she won't have you!" said his lordship handsomely as they went. Chapter 28 and 29 of The Portrait of a Lady. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28 On the morrow, in the evening, Lord Warburton went again to see his friends at their hotel, and at this establishment he learned that they had gone to the opera. He drove to the opera with the idea of paying them a visit in their box after the easy Italian fashion, and when he had obtained his admittance, it was one of the secondary theatres, looked about the large, bare, ill-lighted house. An act had just terminated, and he was at liberty to pursue his quest. After scanning 2 or 3 tiers of boxes, he perceived in one of the largest of these receptacles a lady whom he easily recognised. Miss Archer was seated facing the stage and partly screened by the curtain of the box, and beside her, leaning back in his chair, was Mr. Gilbert Osmond. They appeared to have the place to themselves, and Warburton supposed their companions had taken advantage of the recess to enjoy the relative coolness of the lobby. He stood a while with his eyes on the interesting pair. He asked himself if he should go up and interrupt the harmony. At last he judged that Isabel had seen him, and this accident determined him. There should be no marked holding off. He took his way to the upper regions, and on the staircase met Ralph Touchett slowly descending, his hat at the inclination of ennui, and his hands where they usually were. "I saw you below a moment since, and was going down to you. I feel lonely and want company," was Ralph's greeting. "You've some that's very good, which you've yet deserted." "Do you mean my cousin? Oh, she has a visitor and doesn't want me. Then Miss Stackpole and Bantling have gone out to a café to eat an ice. Miss Stackpole delights in an ice. I didn't think they wanted me either. The opera's very bad, the women look like laundresses and sing like peacocks. I feel very low." "You had better go home," Lord Warburton said, without affectation. "And leave my young lady in this sad place? Ah, no, I must watch over her." "She seems to have plenty of friends." "Yes, that's why I must watch," said Ralph, with the same large mock melancholy. "If she doesn't want you, it's probable she doesn't want me." "No, you're different. Go to the box and stay there, while I walk about." Lord Warburton went to the box, where Isabel's welcome was as to a friend so honourably old that he vaguely asked himself what queer temporal province she was annexing. He exchanged greetings with Mr. Osmond, to whom he had been introduced the day before, and who, after he came in, sat blandly apart and silent, as if repudiating competence in the subjects of allusion now probable. It struck her second visitor that Miss Archer had, in operatic conditions, a radiance, even a slight exaltation. As she was, however, at all times a keenly glancing, quickly moving, completely animated young woman, he may have been mistaken on this point. Her talk with him, moreover, pointed to presence of mind. It expressed a kindness so ingenious and deliberate as to indicate that she was in undisturbed possession of her faculties. Poor Lord Warburton had moments of bewilderment. She had discouraged him, formally, as much as a woman could. What business had she then with such arts and such felicities, above all with such tones of preparation? Her voice had tricks of sweetness, but why play them on him? The others came back. The bare, familiar, trivial opera began again. The box was large, and there was room for him to remain if he would sit a little behind and in the dark. He did so for half an hour, while Mr. Osmond remained in front, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, just behind Isabel. Lord Warburton heard nothing, and from his gloomy corner saw nothing, but the clear profile of this young lady defined against the dim illumination of the house. When there was another interval, no one moved. Mr. Osmond talked to Isabel, and Lord Warburton kept his corner. He did so but for a short time, however, after which he got up and bade good night to the ladies. Isabel said nothing to detain him, but it didn't prevent his being puzzled again. Why should she mark so one of his values, quite the wrong one, when she would have nothing to do with another, which was quite the right? He was angry with himself for being puzzled, and then angry for being angry. Verdi's music did little to comfort him, and he left the theatre and walked homeward, without knowing his way, through the tortuous, tragic streets of Rome, where heavier sorrows than his had been carried under the stars. "What's the character of that gentleman?" Osmond asked of Isabel after he had retired. "Irreproachable, don't you see it?" "He owns about half England, that's his character," Henrietta remarked. "That's what they call a free country." "Ah, he's a great proprietor. Happy man," said Gilbert Osmond. "Do you call that happiness, the ownership of wretched human beings?" cried Miss Stackpole. "He owns his tenants and has thousands of them. It's pleasant to own something, but inanimate objects are enough for me. I don't insist on flesh and blood and minds and consciences." "It seems to me you own a human being or two," Mr. Bantling suggested jocosely. "I wonder if Warburton orders his tenants about as you do me." "Lord Warburton's a great radical," Isabel said. "He has very advanced opinions." "He has very advanced stone walls. His park's enclosed by a gigantic iron fence, some 30 miles round," Henrietta announced, for the information of Mr. Osmond. "I should like him to converse with a few of our Boston radicals." "Don't they approve of iron fences?" asked Mr. Bantling. "Only to shut up wicked Conservatives. I always feel as if I were talking to you over something with a neat top finish of broken glass." "Do you know him well, this unreformed reformer?" Osmond went on, questioning Isabel. "Well enough for all the use I have for him." "And how much of a use is that?" "Well, I used to like him." "Liking to like, why, it makes a passion," said Osmond. "No," she considered. "Keep that for liking to dislike." "Do you wish to provoke me then," Osmond laughed, "to a passion for him?" She said nothing for a moment, but then met the light question with a disproportionate gravity. "No, Mr. Osmond, I don't think I should ever dare to provoke you. Lord Warburton, at any rate," she more easily added, "is a very nice man." "Of great ability?" her friend inquired. "Of excellent ability, and as good as he looks." "As good as he's good looking, do you mean? He's very good looking. How detestably fortunate! To be a great English magnate, to be clever and handsome into the bargain, and by way of finishing off, to enjoy your high favour. That's a man I could envy." Isabel considered him with interest. "You seem to me to be always envying some one. Yesterday it was the Pope, to-day it's poor Lord Warburton." "My envy's not dangerous, it wouldn't hurt a mouse. I don't want to destroy the people, I only want to be them. You see, it would destroy only myself." "You'd like to be the Pope?" said Isabel. "I should love it, but I should have gone in for it earlier. But why," Osmond reverted, "do you speak of your friend as poor?" "Women, when they are very, very good, sometimes pity men after they've hurt them. That's their great way of showing kindness," said Ralph, joining in the conversation for the first time, and with a cynicism so transparently ingenious as to be virtually innocent. "Pray, have I hurt Lord Warburton?" Isabel asked, raising her eyebrows as if the idea were perfectly fresh. "It serves him right if you have," said Henrietta, while the curtain rose for the ballet. Isabel saw no more of her attributive victim for the next 24 hours, but on the second day after the visit to the opera she encountered him in the gallery of the Capitol, where he stood before the lion of the collection, the statue of the dying gladiator. She had come in with her companions, among whom, on this occasion again, Gilbert Osmond had his place, and the party, having ascended the staircase, entered the first and finest of the rooms. Lord Warburton addressed her alertly enough, but said in a moment that he was leaving the gallery. "And I'm leaving Rome," he added. "I must bid you good-bye." Isabel, inconsequently enough, was now sorry to hear it. This was perhaps because she had ceased to be afraid of his renewing his suit. She was thinking of something else. She was on the point of naming her regret, but she checked herself and simply wished him a happy journey, which made him look at her rather unlightedly. "I'm afraid you'll think me very volatile. I told you the other day I wanted so much to stop." "Oh, no, you could easily change your mind." "That's what I have done." "Bon voyage, then." "You're in a great hurry to get rid of me," said his lordship, quite dismally. "Not in the least, but I hate partings." "You don't care what I do," he went on pitifully. Isabel looked at him a moment. "Ah," she said, "you're not keeping your promise." He coloured like a boy of 15. "If I'm not, it's because I can't, and that's why I'm going." "Good-bye, then." "Good-bye." He lingered still, however. "When shall I see you again?" Isabel hesitated, but soon, as if she had had a happy inspiration, "Some day after you're married." "That will never be. It will be after you are." "That will do as well," she smiled. "Yes, quite as well. Good-bye." They shook hands, and he left her alone in the glorious room, among the shining antique marbles. She sat down in the centre of the circle of these presences, regarding them vaguely, resting her eyes on their beautiful blank faces, listening, as it were, to their eternal silence. It is impossible, in Rome at least, to look long at a great company of Greek sculptures without feeling the effect of their noble quietude, which, as with a high door closed for the ceremony, slowly drops on the spirit the large white mantle of peace. I say in Rome especially, because the Roman air is an exquisite medium for such impressions. The golden sunshine mingles with them, the deep stillness of the past, so vivid yet, though it is nothing but a void full of names, seems to throw a solemn spell upon them. The blinds were partly closed in the windows of the Capitol, and a clear warm shadow rested on the figures and made them more mildly human. Isabel sat there a long time, under the charm of their motionless grace, wondering to what, of their experience, their absent eyes were open, and how, to our ears, their alien lips would sound. The dark red walls of the room threw them into relief. The polished marble floor reflected their beauty. She had seen them all before, but her enjoyment repeated itself, and it was all the greater because she was glad again, for the time, to be alone. At last, however, her attention lapsed, drawn off by a deeper tide of life. An occasional tourist came in, stopped and stared a moment at the dying gladiator, and then passed out of the other door, creaking over the smooth pavement. At the end of half an hour Gilbert Osmond reappeared, apparently in advance of his companions. He strolled toward her slowly, with his hands behind him and his usual inquiring, yet not quite appealing smile. "I'm surprised to find you alone. I thought you had company." "So I have, the best," and she glanced at the Antinous and the Faun. "Do you call them better company than an English peer?" "Ah, my English peer left me some time ago." She got up, speaking, with intention, a little dryly. Mr. Osmond noted her dryness, which contributed for him to the interest of his question. "I'm afraid that what I heard the other evening is true. You're rather cruel to that nobleman." Isabel looked a moment at the vanquished gladiator. "It's not true. I'm scrupulously kind." "That's exactly what I mean," Gilbert Osmond returned, and with such happy hilarity that his joke needs to be explained. We know that he was fond of originals, of rarities, of the superior and the exquisite, and now that he had seen Lord Warburton, whom he thought a very fine example of his race and order, he perceived a new attraction in the idea of taking to himself a young lady who had qualified herself to figure in his collection of choice objects by declining so noble a hand. Gilbert Osmond had a high appreciation of this particular patriciate, not so much for its distinction, which he thought easily surpassable, as for its solid actuality. He had never forgiven his star for not appointing him to an English dukedom, and he could measure the unexpectedness of such conduct as Isabel's. It would be proper that the woman he might marry should have done something of that sort. Chapter 29. Ralph Touchett, in talk with his excellent friend, had rather markedly qualified, as we know, his recognition of Gilbert Osmond's personal merits; but he might really have felt himself illiberal in the light of that gentleman's conduct during the rest of the visit to Rome. Osmond spent a portion of each day with Isabel and her companions, and ended by affecting them as the easiest of men to live with. Who wouldn't have seen that he could command, as it were, both tact and gaiety? Which perhaps was exactly why Ralph had made his old-time look of superficial sociability a reproach to him. Even Isabel's invidious kinsman was obliged to admit that he was just now a delightful associate. His good humour was imperturbable, his knowledge of the right fact, his production of the right word, as convenient as the friendly flicker of a match for your cigarette. Clearly he was amused as a man could be who was so little ever surprised, and that made him most applausive. It was not that his spirits were visibly high. He would never, in the concert of pleasure, touch the big drum by so much as a knuckle. He had a mortal dislike to the high ragged note, to what he called random ravings. He thought Miss Archer sometimes of too precipitate a readiness. It was a pity she had that fault, because if she had not had it, she would really have had none. She would have been as smooth to his general need of her as handled ivory to the palm. If he was not personally loud, however, he was deep, and during these closing days of the Roman May he knew a complacency that matched with slow irregular walks under the pines of the Villa Borghese, among the small sweet meadow flowers and the mossy marbles. He was pleased with everything. He had never before been pleased with so many things at once. Old impressions, old enjoyments renewed themselves. One evening, going home to his room at the inn, he wrote down a little sonnet to which he prefixed the title of Rome Revisited. A day or two later he showed this piece of correct and ingenious verse to Isabel, explaining to her that it was an Italian fashion to commemorate the occasions of life by a tribute to the Muse. He took his pleasures in general singly. He was too often, he would have admitted that, too sorely aware of something wrong, something ugly. The fertilizing dew of a conceivable felicity too seldom descended on his spirit. But at present he was happy, happier than he had perhaps ever been in his life, and the feeling had a large foundation. This was simply the sense of success, the most agreeable emotion of the human heart. Osmond had never had too much of it. In this respect he had the irritation of satiety, as he knew perfectly well and often reminded himself. "Ah, no, I've not been spoiled, certainly I've not been spoiled," he used inwardly to repeat. "If I do succeed before I die, I shall thoroughly have earned it." He was too apt to reason as if earning this boon consisted above all of covertly aching for it, and might be confined to that exercise. Absolutely void of it, also, his career had not been. He might indeed have suggested to a spectator here and there that he was resting on vague laurels. But his triumphs were, some of them, now too old. Others had been too easy. The present one had been less arduous than might have been expected, but had been easy, that is, had been rapid, only because he had made an altogether exceptional effort, a greater effort than he had believed it in him to make. The desire to have something or other to show for his parts, to show somehow or other, had been the dream of his youth, but as the years went on the conditions attached to any marked proof of rarity had affected him more and more as gross and detestable, like the swallowing of mugs of beer to advertise what one could stand. If an anonymous drawing on a museum wall had been conscious and watchful, it might have known this peculiar pleasure of being at last and all of a sudden identified, as from the hand of a great master, by the so high and so unnoticed fact of style. His style was what the girl had discovered with a little help, and now, beside herself enjoying it, she should publish it to the world without his having any of the trouble. She should do the thing for him, and he would not have waited in vain. Shortly before the time fixed in advance for her departure, this young lady received from Mrs. Touchett a telegram running as follows: "Leave Florence 4th June for Bellagio, and take you if you have not other views. But can't wait if you dawdle in Rome." The dawdling in Rome was very pleasant, but Isabel had different views, and she let her aunt know she would immediately join her. She told Gilbert Osmond that she had done so, and he replied that, spending many of his summers as well as his winters in Italy, he himself would loiter a little longer in the cool shadow of St. Peter's. He would not return to Florence for 10 days more, and in that time she would have started for Bellagio. It might be months in this case before he should see her again. This exchange took place in the large decorated sitting room occupied by our friends at the hotel. It was late in the evening, and Ralph Touchett was to take his cousin back to Florence on the morrow. Osmond had found the girl alone. Miss Stackpole had contracted a friendship with the delightful American family on the 4th floor, and had mounted the interminable staircase to pay them a visit. Henrietta contracted friendships in travelling with great freedom, and had formed in railway carriages several that were among her most valued ties. Ralph was making arrangements for the morrow's journey, and Isabel sat alone in a wilderness of yellow upholstery. The chairs and sofas were orange, the walls and windows were draped in purple and gilt. The mirrors, the pictures had great flamboyant frames. The ceiling was deeply vaulted and painted over with naked muses and cherubs. For Osmond the place was ugly to distress. The false colours, the sham splendour, were like vulgar, bragging, lying talk. Isabel had taken in hand a volume of Ampère, presented on their arrival in Rome by Ralph, but although she held it in her lap with her finger vaguely kept in the place, she was not impatient to pursue her study. A lamp covered with a drooping veil of pink tissue paper burned on the table beside her, and diffused a strange pale rosiness over the scene. "You say you'll come back, but who knows?" Gilbert Osmond said. "I think you're much more likely to start on your voyage round the world. You're under no obligation to come back. You can do exactly what you choose. You can roam through space." "Well, Italy's a part of space," Isabel answered. "I can take it on the way." "On the way round the world? No, don't do that. Don't put us in a parenthesis. Give us a chapter to ourselves. I don't want to see you on your travels. I'd rather see you when they're over. I should like to see you when you're tired and satiated," Osmond added in a moment. "I shall prefer you in that state." Isabel, with her eyes bent, fingered the pages of Monsieur Ampère. "You turn things into ridicule without seeming to do it, though not, I think, without intending it. You've no respect for my travels. You think them ridiculous." "Where do you find that?" She went on in the same tone, fretting the edge of her book with the paper knife. "You see my ignorance, my blunders, the way I wander about, as if the world belonged to me, simply because it has been put into my power to do so. You don't think a woman ought to do that. You think it bold and ungraceful." "I think it beautiful," said Osmond. "You know my opinions. I've treated you to enough of them. Don't you remember my telling you that one ought to make one's life a work of art? You looked rather shocked at first, but then I told you it was exactly what you seemed to me to be trying to do with your own." She looked up from her book. "What you despise most in the world is stupid art." "Possibly. But yours seemed to me very clear and very good." "If I were to go to Japan next winter you would laugh at me," she went on. Osmond gave a smile, a keen one, but not a laugh, for the tone of their conversation was not jocose. Isabel had in fact her solemnity. He had seen it before. "You have an imagination that startles one." "That's exactly what I say. You think such an idea absurd." "I would give my little finger to go to Japan. It's one of the countries I want most to see. Can't you believe that with my taste for old lacquer?" "I haven't a taste for old lacquer to excuse me," said Isabel. "You've a better excuse, the means of going. You're quite wrong in your theory that I laugh at you. I don't know what has put it into your head." "It wouldn't be remarkable if you did think it ridiculous that I should have the means to travel when you've not. For you know everything and I know nothing." "The more reason why you should travel and learn," smiled Osmond. "Besides," he added, as if a point were to be made, "I don't know everything." Isabel was not struck with the oddity of his saying this gravely. She was thinking that the pleasantest incident of her life, so it pleased her to qualify these too few days in Rome, which she might musingly have likened to the figure of some small princess of one of the ages of dress over muffled in a mantle of state, and dragging a train that it took pages or historians to hold up, that this felicity was coming to an end. That most of the interest of the time had been owing to Mr. Osmond was a reflection she was not just now at pains to make. She had already done the point abundant justice. But she said to herself that if there were a danger they should never meet again, perhaps after all it would be as well. Happy things don't repeat themselves, and her adventure wore already the changed, the seaward face of some romantic island from which, after feasting on purple grapes, she was putting off while the breeze rose. She might come back to Italy and find him different, this strange man who pleased her just as he was, and it would be better not to come than to run the risk of that. But if she was not to come, the greater the pity that the chapter was closed. She felt for a moment a pang that touched the source of tears. The sensation kept her silent, and Gilbert Osmond was silent too. He was looking at her. "Go everywhere," he said at last, in a low, kind voice. "Do everything. Get everything out of life. Be happy. Be triumphant." "What do you mean by being triumphant?" "Well, doing what you like." "The triumph then, it seems to me, is to fail. Doing all the vain things one likes is often very tiresome." "Exactly," said Osmond, with his quiet quickness. "As I intimated just now, you'll be tired some day." He paused a moment, and then he went on. "I don't know whether I had better not wait till then for something I want to say to you." "Ah, I can't advise you without knowing what it is. But I'm horrid when I'm tired," Isabel added, with due inconsequence. "I don't believe that. You're angry sometimes. That I can believe, though I've never seen it. But I'm sure you're never cross." "Not even when I lose my temper?" "You don't lose it. You find it, and that must be beautiful." Osmond spoke with a noble earnestness. "They must be great moments to see." "If I could only find it now!" Isabel nervously cried. I'm not afraid. I shall fold my arms and admire you. I'm speaking very seriously." He leaned forward, a hand on each knee. For some moments he bent his eyes on the floor. "What I wish to say to you," he went on at last, looking up, "is that I find I'm in love with you." She instantly rose. "Ah, keep that till I am tired." "Tired of hearing it from others?" He sat there, raising his eyes to her. "No, you may heed it now or never, as you please. But after all I must say it now." She had turned away, but in the movement she had stopped herself and dropped her gaze upon him. The two remained a while in this situation, exchanging a long look, the large conscious look of the critical hours of life. Then he got up and came near her, deeply respectful, as if he were afraid he had been too familiar. "I'm absolutely in love with you." He had repeated the announcement in a tone of almost impersonal discretion, like a man who expected very little from it, but who spoke for his own needed relief. The tears came into her eyes. This time they obeyed the sharpness of the pang that suggested to her somehow the slipping of a fine bolt. Backward, forward, she couldn't have said which. The words he had uttered made him, as he stood there, beautiful and generous, invested him as with the golden air of early autumn. But morally speaking she retreated before them, facing him still, as she had retreated in the other cases before a like encounter. "Oh, don't say that, please," she answered with an intensity that expressed the dread of having, in this case too, to choose and decide. What made her dread great was precisely the force which, as it would seem, ought to have banished all dread, the sense of something within herself, deep down, that she supposed to be inspired and trustful passion. It was there like a large sum stored in a bank, which there was a terror in having to begin to spend. If she touched it, it would all come out. "I haven't the idea that it will matter much to you," said Osmond. "I've too little to offer you. What I have, it's enough for me, but it's not enough for you. I've neither fortune nor fame, nor extrinsic advantages of any kind. So I offer nothing. I only tell you because I think it can't offend you, and some day or other it may give you pleasure. It gives me pleasure, I assure you," he went on, standing there before her, considerately inclined to her, turning his hat, which he had taken up, slowly round with a movement which had all the decent tremor of awkwardness and none of its oddity, and presenting to her his firm, refined, slightly ravaged face. "It gives me no pain because it's perfectly simple. For me you'll always be the most important woman in the world." Isabel looked at herself in this character, looked intently, thinking she filled it with a certain grace. But what she said was not an expression of any such complacency. "You don't offend me, but you ought to remember that, without being offended, one may be incommoded, troubled." Incommoded. She heard herself saying that, and it struck her as a ridiculous word. But it was what stupidly came to her. "I remember perfectly. Of course you're surprised and startled. But if it's nothing but that, it will pass away, and it will perhaps leave something that I may not be ashamed of." "I don't know what it may leave. You see at all events that I'm not overwhelmed," said Isabel, with rather a pale smile. "I'm not too troubled to think. And I think that I'm glad we're separating, that I leave Rome to-morrow." "Of course I don't agree with you there." "I don't at all know you," she added abruptly. And then she coloured as she heard herself saying what she had said almost a year before to Lord Warburton. "If you were not going away you'd know me better." "I shall do that some other time." "I hope so. I'm very easy to know." "No, no," she emphatically answered. "There you're not sincere. You're not easy to know. No one could be less so." "Well," he laughed, "I said that because I know myself. It may be a boast, but I do." "Very likely. But you're very wise." "So are you, Miss Archer," Osmond exclaimed. "I don't feel so just now. Still I'm wise enough to think you had better go. Good night." "God bless you," said Gilbert Osmond, taking the hand which she failed to surrender. After which he added, "If we meet again you'll find me as you leave me. If we don't, I shall be so all the same." "Thank you very much. Good-bye." There was something quietly firm about Isabel's visitor. He might go of his own movement, but wouldn't be dismissed. "There's one thing more. I haven't asked anything of you, not even a thought in the future. You must do me that justice. But there's a little service I should like to ask. I shall not return home for several days. Rome's delightful, and it's a good place for a man in my state of mind. Oh, I know you're sorry to leave it, but you're right to do what your aunt wishes." "She doesn't even wish it," Isabel broke out strangely. Osmond was apparently on the point of saying something that would match these words, but he changed his mind, and rejoined simply, "Ah, well, it's proper you should go with her, very proper. Do everything that's proper. I go in for that. Excuse my being so patronising. You say you don't know me, but when you do you'll discover what a worship I have for propriety." "You're not conventional?" Isabel gravely asked. "I like the way you utter that word. No, I'm not conventional. I'm convention itself. You don't understand that?" And he paused a moment, smiling. "I should like to explain it." Then, with a sudden quick bright naturalness, "Do come back again," he pleaded. "There are so many things we might talk about." She stood there with lowered eyes. "What service did you speak of just now?" "Go and see my little daughter before you leave Florence. She's alone at the villa. I decided not to send her to my sister, who hasn't at all my ideas. Tell her she must love her poor father very much," said Gilbert Osmond gently. "It will be a great pleasure to me to go," Isabel answered. "I'll tell her what you say. Once more, good-bye." On this he took a rapid, respectful leave. When he had gone she stood a moment looking about her, and seated herself very slowly, with an air of deliberation. She sat there till her companions came back, with folded hands gazing at the ugly carpet. Her agitation, for it had not diminished, was very still, very deep. What had happened was something that for a week past her imagination had been going forward to meet. But here, when it came, she stopped. That sublime principle somehow broke down. The working of this young lady's spirit was strange, and I can only give it to you as I see it, not hoping to make it seem altogether natural. Her imagination, as I say, now hung back. There was a last vague space it couldn't cross, a dusky, uncertain tract, which looked ambiguous and even slightly treacherous, like a moorland seen in the winter twilight. But she was to cross it yet. End of chapter 29.